All right, we're here for another series of interviews that we're doing with folks that were involved in the civil rights movement and civil rights activity in the 1960s and beyond. I'm Professor Rob Waddell. I'm in the history department here at the University of Rhode Island. And I'll let Dan introduce himself, and then we'll just have some conversation about his experience and the like. So, Dan.
So I am Dan Lynn Watt. I'm a retired educator. I was an educator primarily in mathematics and science education, and I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Great. And so tell us, I guess a little bit about where you grew up and what your experience was that sort of brought you to where you were going to be going to do movement activity in the 1960s.
So I grew up in New York City, and I grew up in a family that was involved with the communist movement. And there's a whole history of the kind of experiences I had because I grew up as a child. I was born in 1940, and I lived through the 50s through my teenage years, and had a lot of experience with what's called McCarthyism. Anyway, the period of the Red Scare was a time that was very important to me. But basically, I grew up in a family that was very idealistic. My family believed in international brotherhood. They believed in workers' rights. They believed in basically that everyone was equal. And I lived in an interracial community in New York City, neighborhood, I mean. And my parents had a lot of friends of African American primarily. And so I grew up feeling that was completely normal to be equal and sort of friends with everybody, so to speak, regardless of race. When I was 6 years old, I was living in Freeport, New York, before we moved to New York City. I'm just going to tell this one little story. There was an incident in Freeport, New York, where a group of 4 African American brothers who were servicemen were denied. This was 1946. This was just after World War II, and they were denied service in a restaurant in Freeport, and they started complaining. The police were called. Policemen lined these men up and shot them. 2 of them were killed. 1 was wounded. The 3rd one was arrested and sent to prison. I became aware of this because my parents got very involved in protesting against the police action. And that was called a lynching in Freeport, New York, 1946. So I became aware at a very young age that African Americans were not being treated fairly. I mean, the word we used at the time was Negroes. Were not being treated fairly in this country. And that understanding stayed with me. And when I was 16, I had this amazing experience. I decided to go to a church service at a cathedral near where I was living. I was living in the west side of Manhattan. I went to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is the Episcopal Cathedral of New York City. And the speaker was a young man from the South, a civil rights leader from the South. He was, I knew his name, but I didn't know anything about him. He was Martin Luther King Jr. I was 16, he was 27. And I heard him speak from the pulpit to a packed crowd of largely African American, but racially mixed group. And he was so inspiring. We all know those words and that rhetoric and the way he could use language and the way he could inspire people and his message of brotherhood. And he felt the inevitability of the success of the movement was one of the things he was preaching about that day. And this was a few months after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott.
Right, I was going to say it's 1956,
yeah.
When you were...
January, this was May of 1956, this event. Okay. So that just really kind of totally inspired me in terms of the struggle for civil rights, that I knew that was one of the places I was going to put my energy as I got older. And and that this was before the country as a whole knew of Martin Luther King, except those who were particularly following the civil rights movement in Montgomery. So that's sort of background and kind of lead you in. And political activity was natural in my family. And I grew up being involved in political activities of different kinds as a teenager, being involved in different kinds of protests and marches in New York City. I would go on buses to Washington for civil rights marches in the 50s. In 1960, I went to Cornell University for graduate school, and I got involved with a very free-form political movement at Cornell that was basically confronting, I would say, the established American policy, not in a violent way, but just in an intellectual way primarily, and through protests. We were confronting the nuclear arm race. We were confronting the whole issue of segregation. We had an organization at Cornell called the Cornell Committee Against Segregation that was operating even before I got there, but it was really activated at the time of the sit-ins in 1960, which coincided with my going to Cornell. So it was a very active group. We would go and picket the Woolworths in downtown Ithaca. People thought we were really peculiar because Woolworths didn't discriminate in Ithaca. But actually, I think it was that kind of picketing all over the country that led many national chains to order their local stores to desegregate. They didn't want the publicity. In 1961, several of my friends went and joined the Freedom Rides. I thought about that a long time and decided not to go for reasons I don't think I have time to go into here. They were personally interesting, personal reasons. But in 1963, one of my friends from Cornell spent the summer in Fayette County, Tennessee. So I have to say something about Fayette County, Tennessee. Fayette County had been in the news in the early 1960s because for the first time in 80 years, there became a voting rights campaign, a local voting rights campaign in Fayette County. Fayette County is in the southwestern corner of Tennessee. It's adjacent to Mississippi. Its economy was cotton farming and sharecropping. So the vast majority of the land was owned by white landowners and worked by tenant farmers who owned nothing and who lived in very primitive housing and who did not have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to eat in restaurants in the county towns. It had been a segregated area for years and years. But in the early 1960s, a local organization in Fayette County started working for the right to vote. And when people registered to vote, went down to the county registrar. The registrars tried to delay and all that sort of thing. But when someone went to the registrar to vote, they were evicted from their lands as sharecroppers. And a bunch of them moved into what was called Tent City, and this was on the lands owned by some African-American landowners, owned some land and donated it for people to get up tents, and this got a lot of publicity. They received a lot of assistance especially from religious organizations in the north, the Quakers, Unitarians, other religious groups sent food, sent clothing, sent tenting supplies, and things and it got a lot of publicity that these people were living in tents, called Tent City. I mean, later that same kind of thing happened in other places, but that's the first one that made the national news. A couple, friends of mine, a little older than me, spent the summer of 1963 in Fayette County working with the local leaders. And they spent the summer working with teenagers on doing marches in the county seat or doing protests in helping people register to vote. They came back to Cornell and they said, look, Next year, there's going to be an election in Fayette County, Tennessee. The majority of the voters are black. Most of them have never voted. A number of them are now registered, but they never had anything to vote for. There had been a federal injunction against the county officials and the county business people and the landowners not to interfere with people's right to vote, so that there was registration of African Americans in Fayette County. He said if we could get about 15 people to come down to Fayette County next summer, we could make a difference. We could help the people register. We could educate them about voting, teach them about voting. We could encourage them to vote. We could build some enthusiasm. We might actually be able to win an election for county sheriff. And this would have been revolutionary, quote unquote, at the time for African Americans. Actually, the candidate for sheriff was a white man who had been already sympathetic to the blacks in Fayette County. And there was also on the ticket a African American man who was running for county tax assessor. Those were two offices that they were contesting that summer. So the idea was, if a bunch of people would go there and work throughout the county and help organize, and this is what the local leaders requested this. They said, look, if you can get some people to come down and help us, that we may be able to win this election. And the idea caught on among folks at Cornell. We said, yes, we're going to do this. And we spent a year organizing and training ourselves and created our own organization, our own fundraising campaigns. Mississippi Freedom Summer had not yet been announced as something that was happening.
Right, because you're doing this from 63 into 64.
Yeah. So this was from the summer of 63, the September, I'd say, of 63, through 64. We organized. We got a group, we got people who were willing to make commitments, we formed partnerships, we were going to work in pairs. In the end, we had 40 people that went down from Cornell primarily. Some were graduates of Cornell and some were relatives of the people at Cornell, but basically it's a group of 40 people, graduate and undergraduate students from Cornell University, who spent the summer of 64 in Fayette County, Tennessee.
And how... those initial folks that had been down there and came back to Cornell to say, do you know how they ended up in Fayette County?
Yeah, actually I do. They were wanting to do something in the South. They wanted to get involved with something in the South, and they asked some people involved in the civil rights movement, where might they go where the people needed some help, or would be willing to welcome some help. And they were directed to Fayette County. Oh. And
they asked folks in SNCC or?
I don't think it was SNCC. I'm not sure. I can look that up, but it was not SNCC. SNCC was not active in Fayette County. Okay. The NAACP was not active in Fayette County. They had their own organization called the Fayette County Civic and Welfare League. They had ties to the NAACP in Memphis. They had... but they were a strictly local organization, and maybe that's why these people said, well, you can go there. They don't have civil rights workers helping them out there. And the leaders, there were two African-American families who were basically were spearheading the civil rights effort and started it in Fayette County. John and Viola McFerrin and Harpman and Minnie Jameson. And John and Harpman, the men in these two couples, had been in the service in World War II, and they came back to Fayette County, and they found out they could not serve on juries because they weren't registered to vote. So no black had ever served on a jury in Fayette County, at least since Reconstruction, and no one had voted. So they really set out to change that themselves. And that's what led to the Tent City episode that I mentioned earlier. So when my two friends, married couple, came back, and they had been there for the summer, they had had a lot of experience with being chased by white truckloads of people in pickup trucks, by trying to phone the Justice Department, actually they made contact with the Justice Department a number of times. The Justice Department assured them that they would enforce the injunction in Fayette, there was existing injunction in Fayette County against interfering with the right to vote. So, obviously I could talk at length. I am talking at length.
Which is what we brought you here to do.
Good,
So
that's great. Okay, so thank you. So I'll just say a few things about the preparation. One of the things was fundraising, and we fundraised throughout the Cornell University community as well as through the community of Ithaca and surrounding towns. We formed an organization called the Tompkins County Committee for Free and Fair Elections in Fayette County, Tennessee. People from Fayette County came up and gave talks at the university, and so that we tried to involve more than just the university, especially in terms of fundraising. We actually had a campaign to get the student union to donate money, Cornell Student Union, which is funds that the undergraduates had to pay, to part of their fees for going there. And the student union governing body wanted to donate $1,000 to the campaign. And it resulted in a referendum, essentially a campus-wide referendum among the undergraduates. The graduate students were not part of this, the student body. And and to everyone's surprise, the referendum passed the grant of $1,000 to the committee. So the student body had gotten energized at Cornell. It was so one of the things that we were doing was we were educating our home community about what was going on in the South, and that was one of our goals, to do that. We also spent the summer in educating and training ourselves. We learned about the economy in Fayette County. We learned about the legal system. We learned the history of the civil rights movement. We had some nonviolence training. We discussed as a group, were we going to defend ourselves if we were attacked? We decided no, we would not defend ourselves. We would be entirely nonviolent. Some people said they wanted to carry a baseball bat in their car. No, we ruled that out as a group, so that we had decided we were going to be nonviolent, that with that many people in the county, and with the kind of tensions that were going to be present in Fayette County during this election campaign and during this time, that nonviolence was the only practical strategy. It's not that everyone was nonviolent. We were not all Martin Luther King, advocates of nonviolence, but we took it as a strategy and we adopted it and we kept it. So the way it worked out, since we had so many people, we had teams in every part of Fayette County. There were like 12 districts in Fayette County, regions, and we had a team in each region, 2 people. We each had a car. One of our first things we had to do was go to Memphis and register our car, because someone had bought a bunch of old clunkers and donated some money. Somebody in Nashville actually had raised money for cars and had a bunch of clunkers, and we had to go to Nashville, to Memphis, to get driver's licenses. We all got Tennessee driver's licenses, and we had Tennessee plates on the cars. So we wanted to be...
Was that a deliberate strategy?
Yes,
to have...
we wanted to be as inconspicuous as possible. If we were stopped while driving, we wanted to have a valid Tennessee driver's license. We stayed with black families throughout the county, and these families were given a very small amount of money every week to feed us, and they put us up, in the situation. The circumstances varied, but we lived with black families in the county, and my partner and I lived with 2 different black families during our time there, because we had an interesting incident that I'll tell you about. Our first home was with a fairly comfortable home of a very well-to-do black family, landowners who owned 900 acres of land and even had their own sharecroppers. And they were, they had a very nice home. They had a normal American home of the 1960s. They had a television set, they had hot and cold running water, showers, things like that. Most of the homes in Fayette County, African American homes, did not have that. They were mostly shacks with outhouses and much less comfortable facilities. Well, one day, one Saturday, I think it was a Saturday afternoon, my partner and I were there staying at the house for a while, and the woman of the house came to the room we were staying in and said, "You have a visitor." We came out, and there was the sheriff of Fayette County, the white sheriff of Fayette County, sitting at the table. He did not fit my stereotype of a Southern sheriff. He was a small, bespectacled man, very polite. He said, "I just want to check in with you boys. You boys ain't from around here, are you?" "No, sir, we're from New York." "Well, I just want you to know, you don't get yourselves into no trouble, there'll be no trouble here. We don't want no trouble here in Fayette County. You stay off of other people's lands, you don't trespass on people's lands, and you stay out of trouble, and you won't have no trouble. Just want you all to know that." I said, "I know you ain't down here for no vacation." And then he just got up and left. And the next day, our hosts told us that we would have to move to another house, that they didn't think it was safe for us, is what they said, and probably they felt it wasn't safe for them as well. So let's see. So what did we do? I'm going to come to the work now, because I think that's really the important part of it. I could say more about the living conditions and that, but that was very similar to what was found in Mississippi. So our job was to, for the first half of the summer, to get as many people as possible to register to vote who were not yet registered. So we worked with a local district leader, African-American man. We would go around to people's houses during the day and ask if they were registered. If they said they were not registered, then we would try to arrange with this man, the local man, to get them rides into, you could only register in the county seat, Somerville, which was about 20 miles away. And so you had to get a ride there. You could only register on Wednesdays. That was the only day the registration was open. And so our idea was to flood the courthouse every Wednesday with people wanting to register, because this had caused a lot of headlines before in the papers, lines of people around the block, 1961, the tent city days, waiting to register. So we also found when we did this that the registrar had set up a system whereby only certain districts of the county could register on any given Wednesday. So really it meant there was only maybe one Wednesday in that summer when people from our district could register, but we didn't know what it was, so we kept sending people down to register. The other thing we did was the other main way of reaching people was by speaking in churches on Sundays. And I thought when I came here today, I thought I would wear a suit, because believe it or not, when we packed to go to Fayette County, we all took suits. And mine was something like this. It was probably the same color, similar material, lightweight summer suit. And we were going to go to church every Sunday. And we were going to speak in the churches. People wanted us to speak in the churches. So the churches were the only place where African Americans could gather on land and property that was their own property. So if we had meetings, we sometimes had meetings during the week, which were not nearly as well attended, but they would also be in the churches. The churches were the core of the African American community in Fayette County. I grew up in a secular family. I grew up in a family, I did not grow up going to church. I'd hardly ever been in a church at age 24 when I went to Fayette County. I'd been to some friends' weddings. I'd, heard Martin Luther King and been to church on a few special occasions, but I had not experienced what I was to experience in those churches, because what I experienced was a kind of community solidarity that was beyond words. It was a intense experience of music and preaching that everyone participated in. And to say that I was sort of unprepared for it, and I mean, we had studied this, I knew something about it, but I was totally emotionally unprepared for how completely engrossing this would be to me. First day we went to church, I was shocked because at the end of the service they said, now we'd like you all to say something. I hadn't prepared for that. Silly as that may sound, I wasn't ready, and I got up and I stammered something about, we're happy to be there, we're here to help them register. We're happy to meet you all. They applauded. Outside the church, they all shook my partner and my hands. They shook our hands. They said, you're the first white people that have ever come to this church. We are so glad you're here. You are going to help us. They were extremely, at least in wherever we were in public or wherever we met people, they were very enthusiastic about our presence. What they felt privately, what some people felt privately, I wasn't so sure. I got a sense later that not all the African Americans were happy about us being there. So one of the things that happened to me was, I describe it as that I learned to be a freedom preacher. I learned to talk in something like the style and rhetoric of the preachers. It's a little embarrassing me now to think of doing that. But I'd like to read you something I wrote in a letter home, if you don't mind. That's why I brought this along. And this is what I wrote in a letter. So this is probably what I said. I said, this is the kind of speech we're giving in churches. God didn't make but one race, the human race. God did not mean for some people to be slaves, to be bought and sold by other people. God didn't mean for white folks to have all the power and colored folks to have none. Now, we all know how Moses led the children of Israel out of slavery, but he could not have done that if no one had followed him. We came down here from the north to help you register and vote, but now you need to stand up for your own freedom. If you're not registered, get yourself down to Somerville next Wednesday. If you are registered, take your father, your mother, your wife, your husband, your sons and daughters. This is the time, this is the place to stand up for freedom. And all of this was punctuated by amen and you say right and things like that. It was an interactive in that way. It was just an incredible experience for me to be able to do that. Now, was I speaking for myself in my own way? Yes, I was. I was bringing them the message that we wanted to bring them. And also I was trying to adopt their idiom. The reason I say it sort of embarrasses me is because I didn't believe in that God had done this or that, but I knew that that was the way the story went. They believed it. They called us Freedom Riders, actually. This was interesting. In Fayette County, they called us Freedom Riders, not making a distinction between what was known as the Freedom Rides. And they said, you are come. God has sent you to help us take our rightful place. And so I don't know if I was being exploitive. I was certainly trying to adapt to a culture that was not my natural culture and trying to be effective. And I think it was effective. Mm-hmm. So I have, looking back on that, I have some embarrassment about it, but I feel like this is what I'm trying to get at is how thoroughly we tried to absorb the culture and the way of speaking and to meet the people on their own ground, so to speak.
So how long were you there for then?
We were there for about 2.5 months. We came in early June and we left in mid-August. I guess a little less than 2.5 months. We spent the month of June, the month of July. Halfway through July, the registration stopped. It ended because the election was on, I think, August 6th. I think that was the date. And so a month before the election, registration stopped. So it was really important for us to be there as early as we could. And for the rest of the summer, we did what we called, we did these same kind of talks in churches to encourage people to vote. And we got some sample ballots from the county office, of the voting office or election department, and made copies and brought them around the county and showed people, where they could mark, how they could vote, what the ballots looked like, what the voting was like. We also told them about how they had a right to a secret ballot. Nobody could watch them mark their ballots. They had to have a private place. Some people were trained as poll watchers. I was not involved in that. But so there was that kind of campaigning. And it really was an election campaign. It was more than just free and fair elections in Fayette County. We were really at that time pushing for these candidates who had the support of the black civil rights leaders. And so we knew something about the registration rolls. We believed we had more blacks on the registration rolls than whites by this time. The whites, blacks outnumbered whites in Fayette County by 2-1 in the general population. The registration was not that ratio, but a small number more. And on election day, the vote did not go our way. The vote counting did not go our way, I should say. We documented a bunch of irregularities at the polls, more votes being listed for the incumbent sheriff than the total number of people who'd gone into the polls, according to the people we had outside watching the polls. Poll watchers who were not allowed to come into the polls to observe. Voters who said they had not been given private spaces to vote, et cetera, et cetera. So we made a long list of irregularities and reported them all to the FBI in Memphis. A couple of things more that I think were significant. One of our strategies in the summer was, since we had a lot of people from the North, we were going to use our contacts in the North to get as much publicity as possible. This was true of Mississippi Freedom Summer as well, that we would use people's home media and home families and friends at home to kind of shine the light of public interest on Fayette County. We did succeed in getting a New York Times reporter to come to Fayette County. We did succeed in getting an NBC reporter to come to Fayette County. But we did not get the Justice Department support that we felt we were going to get. We did not get the FBI support we felt we were going to get because of Mississippi, because all the attention was focused on Mississippi, and rightly so. So that it was we had felt that if we could get enough publicity, the Justice Department would send observers to the elections and make sure that they were carried out properly. They did not do that. They didn't have, they were all in Mississippi. So the election was lost, and we were discouraged, of course. Something I didn't learn until much more recently was that 2 years later, they elected 2 African Americans to countywide office in 1966. And from that time on, after that, I was no longer involved with Fayette County, but the African American community was mobilized for elections. They were mobilized for school integration. They were mobilized for anti-poverty programs under the Johnson administration. They were able to get funding for different things that did not go through the county officials, but went through some other agency that could get it directly to the community. So that they had made a lot of gains. And that summer was part of it. Not the whole thing. There were other outside people coming. Some of our people came back to Fayette County the following year, about 8 or 10. Other people from other colleges came to Fayette County another year, so that it became a place that, while it was not in the news for civil rights, It was a place that was making progress.
So when
Take a breather here for a minute.
so so when you were there up into August of 1964. When you left, and I assume that most of the folks, that had been there that summer, left in August.
Yeah.
Were there any folks that stayed there permanently, or was it just until the next summer when students could come back?
I think there were one or two people that stayed on, and they would send back reports to the rest of us from time to time, and then,
And did you get any sense that there were folks in the black community there that were just sort of waiting for you to leave?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because what I was there was a group within the black community that was opposed to the Fayette County Civic and Welfare League, and I think this had to do with a kind of political rivalry within the county. It's been documented elsewhere. Very interesting story that I can't go into, but at the time we were there, we were told these other people were Uncle Toms. They were working with the sheriff. They were working against our project. And there was one local leader who had originally been part of the Civil Rights Coalition there, who had formed his own group, and they were rivals. And they were rivals for funding, they were rivals for publicity, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the meetings, this was something that I remember this very vividly. One of the meetings we had, a man came to the meeting who was part of this other faction. And he said to us, to my partner and myself, he said, these folks, they're going to listen to you because you were white. We've been telling them the same thing about voting for the last 5 years, and they don't listen to us. And then you're going to go home, and where will they be? So, at the time, I just kind of dismissed that because it wasn't something I needed to pay attention to. I thought it was not the representative of the community, and I don't know how representative it was. But afterwards, I thought, okay, he's right. We did go home. And the people who stuck their neck out to vote were left with the situation. Now, by this time, Fayette County was already moving in a lot of different ways towards what it became years later. Basically, the cotton farmers had decided that they were going to mechanize the cotton farming. But this took a period of years, but gradually the African American population was reduced because they mechanized the farming. They needed far fewer workers.
To move Memphis, other places.
They had to move off to Memphis and other places and find other ways to make a living. And some people stayed, and they did get, some people got elected to the school board and got elected to county office. I think they did have an African-American sheriff at some point in the county. They had integrated schools, although there was a white academy that was started, a private school for white kids only. But the movement had kind of built its own confidence. And where were they getting support then? They did get a lot of support from the federal government in the Johnson years. One of the members, one of the women in Fayette County, one of the leaders, Viola McFerrin, a very amazing and wonderful person, became part of I don't exactly call it, I would say the advisory board, I don't know what it's called, for the anti-poverty program. And so she would go up to Washington and meet with Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president, and his deputies, and so she became a person who could organize legal challenges when necessary, like they had to do legal challenges to get the schools integrated. She could organize the disbursement of funds through legitimate county organizations rather than the county authorities that were the main way that the federal government disperses funds is to give it to the states, who give it to the counties, who supposedly disperse it to the people. So they became influential. They had some political clout in an odd sort of way, and they were able to build some confidence and become part of the political and the system. So that this was all part of it. It was one part of it, one summer out of many years of work and struggle. And this has been documented. Actually, one of the college students who went to Fayette County did an oral history project. You'd be interested in this. There's a book called Our Portion of Hell. And it's an oral history of the civil rights struggle in Fayette County. And it goes from back in the 50s all the way up to the 70s. And he interviewed people, and they're collected them in transcripts in a book. And I'll give you the reference later, but it's an excellent source book.
Right.
You know, it's
right.
not a book that's written about Fayette County. It's the people telling you their stories. It's quite remarkable.
So when you unfortunately, you know, I say this in every interview, we have to think about ways of concluding in 5 or 10 minutes or so. I think,
right.
But for you, when you left in '64, you didn't go back then after that. So where did you go back? Did you finish graduate studies at Cornell? And one of the things, you know, they always think is, when you're doing all that work, did you actually go to class and, you know, and do the work in graduate school? Is always
I did.
Fun.
Not everyone did, but
right.
I did.
So you went back to finish at Cornell?
I finished a degree, PhD in engineering. But while I was in Fayette County, this is sort of an odd coincidence. One of my fellow civil rights workers from Cornell told me about an education project in science education that her father, who was an electrical engineering professor at Cornell, was involved in. So when I got back to Cornell, I went and talked to this man. And he said, yes, we are trying to engage people like you in doing education for kids. So we've got a project that you can come work on. We want you to get your degree because we're funded by the National Science Foundation, and they want people who have PhDs in science to be involved in this. So you can get your degree, and we will have a place for you if you want. I mean, I went through an interview process and the rest of it, but I did. So following my PhD, I went and came to Boston to work with a curriculum development project, developing science curriculum for elementary schools. And that's where I found my vocation, was in science and mathematics education. And I've worked in that both as a classroom teacher, as a teacher of teachers, as a curriculum writer, as a researcher, many different aspects of educational work for my career. And so that was sort of, it happened by coincidence that it was a conversation, an odd side conversation I had in Fayette County that led me to this. I don't know.
That in and of itself is you know, as any teacher will tell you, is part of being an activist and part of work. But did you stay involved in other more sort of explicit, I guess, ways that we think about organizing activity and the like?
Yes. Well, I think as a historian, you know very well what was coming on in our country after 1964 was the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And that became the main concern of the political activists on campus. So, what can I say? It was, we felt that was where our energy was most needed, to try to stop that war and to educate people about it. And we also set out a process of campus-wide education. And we had teach-ins, and we had a lot of events where we educated people. We had scholars who knew the history of Vietnam who came and talked about it. We had soldiers who were on campus who'd returned from Vietnam tell about their experiences, which was very interesting for those of us who had not been in the military and avoided military service, let's say, chose not to be in the military, which was definitely me, to start becoming friends with people who had been in the military and understand their experience in Vietnam. And they became part of that movement. I mean, they came to see that what they'd been doing in Vietnam was part of something that was wrong and should be ended. So they became part of that. So that was where for the next few years, most of my political effort went into that movement.
And what about anything, later on that you were involved in?
I guess I've always been wanting to live in an integrated community, always wanting to work against inequities in society, whether it's through working in education, which I saw as part of that, or through being part of other community organizations. Right now, I live in a co-housing community in Cambridge, which is a kind of cooperative, and we are trying to live cooperatively. We have a group of about 40 families and individuals, children, young children, babies, through a woman who's 90, just turned 90, in our community, and we are trying to live collaboratively and communally with each other and use that as a model for how other people can organize their lives. Certainly got involved in the movement for local agriculture and that sort of thing. It was, I don't think I was ever part of something as intense as politically, overtly as intense as what I got involved in Cornell in my graduate school days. Because when I got a little older, I had a family, my work became important to me, and I wanted to have work that would make a difference in the world, and I think it did. So that was a little bit where things went for me. I do think living in co-housing is important because we want to live in an environmentally sound way. And we do, and we get local food delivered to our place from a farm nearby. And so that we're sort of trying to model a different lifestyle.
Well, the one thing I've been asking, towards the end, and I keep saying in all the interviews as well, is, that hopefully we'll find some time to do an even more extended kind of interview at some point to capture some of the other stories that you surely have and so on. But one of the things we've been trying to do in some of these interviews is also for some of the students that are here at the University of Rhode Island that may be, using them or watching them, is to get some sense for how you can take those experiences of when you are a young person, whether you're in college or you're in graduate school, and find ways to become an activist or find ways to do the kind of stuff yourself. So is there anything that out of your own experience that you would say is useful or helpful or might be something that you would want to share with folks that are sort of searching for those kinds of things for themselves?
This is going to sound a little weird, but I'm going to talk about my granddaughter, who is 20. And when she was in high school, she joined an organization called the Food Project. They call themselves a food justice social change organization. It's a group primarily in the Boston area. There are other groups like it around the country where they involve inner city and suburban youths in the process of growing and food distribution, and the idea of food equality, that everyone can have good quality organic food. And they train the students in leadership. Our granddaughter became a very effective leader in this group. She's still working for them. They do lectures on food justice on college campuses and high schools. They teach the students how to cook They distribute the food, they grow the food, they distribute it through a farm share and through a farmer's market. They work in soup kitchens and local community kitchens to provide food for people that need food. They work with local chefs. Many of the local chefs in the Cambridge area are helping them learn to cook. So, so food is a major problem in our society, and it's something that I'm so impressed with these young people who have made this commitment to involve themselves in this particular way. So I would say to the students, there's something going on in your community, whether it's about the immigrants' rights or about anti-poverty work or food justice or voting rights. I think these students should vote. And they should campaign for the right to vote, and they should make sure they and their relatives and their friends vote, and they inform themselves about politics. I don't think there's any shortage of things in their local communities that they can look around and find something to be involved in, and I think they'll find it rewarding. I just raised the food project as a kind of surprising example. It was surprising to me, and that I'm a very strong advocate of this particular group right now.
Great. Well, yeah, I think that we've heard that from a number of folks that that this idea of finding something in your community, and that sense I think you get from coming out of doing that sort of local grassroots kind of work like you were doing. I think is something that informs what a lot of people have been saying, and it is the way and the path into some of this. So, well, thank you for sitting with us and under the hot spotlights here.
And thank you for taking the time to do this interview. You've listened to a lot of them today, so.
Great.
I've enjoyed having a chance to talk about this experience, so thank you.
Great, and we'll maybe get to capture even more of it at a future date too.
If you'd like to, I'd certainly be more than happy to come and talk some more about it, or talk to students.
Yeah.
I think my wife and she's also here being interviewed. She had a different experience also, but we would be happy to come and talk to students if that's something that would be useful in the education program.
Yeah, great.
So, thank you.